I grew up and was educated in Britain. Now, for a country called Britain, Great Britain, it was always surprising to me how we were taught very little about the history of this country. It's strange, isn't it, that people who are British know very little of the British Empire. The standard of education in my country at high school level and college level I've always felt was poor. And I go into more detail about this in my review of John Gatto's Dumbing Us Down, but the subject of history was particularly interesting in that it was so uninteresting and boring when we studied it in school. It was only after I left academic education that my love for history was ignited and cultivated. We learned a bit about the Holocaust in school, a few things here and there that happened in World War II, the Tudors, the Romans, that kind of generic stuff, just dipping your toes into each of the few subjects you came across. But why do we know so much about World War II but not World War I? Is it because it's effortless to paint Britain as the good guys, fighting off evil when looking at World War II, and practically impossible to do this when taking a stab at World War I? Why have the students of Britain not been educated on the British Empire? Is it because some horrifying truths and uncomfortable discussions would come about, especially taking into account the multicultural society of modern-day Britain? Anyone who does have knowledge of the British Empire will know what I'm talking about. It was not a holy entity looking to liberate the world, which seems to be the consensus of polls that are conducted in this country, whose participants are seemingly woefully oblivious or else intentionally ignorant. It was not a glorious, righteous, generous giver of liberty and democracy. Rather, it was a racist force of oppression and imperialism, and that very imperialism being the backbone that made the nation so rich and prosperous today. This is a school of thought that is becoming more prominent in the vernacular of modern-day thinkers, in addition to a resistance which seeks to defend the empire. But aside from a few instances here and there I knew of, plus having an ancestral link to one of Britain's former colonies in which atrocities took place, I was thirsty to be taught just what exactly the British Empire did. And looking around me, in a country becoming increasingly nationalistic and jigonistic day by day, it didn't look easy finding answers, aside from a brilliant and hilarious horrible history sketch where Helper tells Queen Victoria that practically everything in Britain is foreign and stolen. I came across a book called A People's History of the United States of America by Howard Zinn, where Zinn presents a neglected side of history of the US to counter the more traditional nationalistic glorification of the country. And a bit of a rabbit hole dig led me here, to John Newsinger's The Blood Never Dried, A People's History of the British Empire, which received high praise from journalists and historians I respect immensely, such as John Pilger, who said the book is a superb, concise antidote to the current attempt to return the British Empire to its false respectability. It took me ages to actually purchase the book, I just couldn't find it. But I guess good things come to those who wait, because when it did come to stock online, it was the second edition, where Newsinger also takes on the brutality and humiliations of British imperialism in Iraq and Afghanistan. In this incredibly researched but highly accessible work, Newsinger seeks to uncover the neglected history of repression and resistance at the heart of the British Empire, and also why a declining British Empire sought to align itself in a subordinate role with the United States of America, in what today is known as the special relationship. I decided, starting with this book, to start underlining particularly interesting lines, dates, names or pieces of information, as this is said to help your memory upon rereading passages. It was a great help, as was Newsinger's ability to have the extraordinary amount of information in his unique book have a seamless flow to it. Incredible claims are made, like Winston Churchill, beloved in this country for fighting fascism, calling Indians a beastly people, and being responsible for a famine which left more than 3 million people dead, something which his own viceroy was appalled at. But for the doubters, skeptics and those who don't want their image of the British Empire shattered, the evidence is all there in Newsinger's footnotes. He chooses not to make the book incomprehensible by listing all the sources there on the pages, instead putting a number on certain claims and having a reference page at the end, which is astonishingly almost 50 pages long in of itself. The things that this book details are those things that will never be taught in British schools, at least not English schools, but which should be mandatory, if not least because it would highlight where we are repeating our mistakes in history. The Iraq War, for example, being one of many instances where the British government fed its people lies so they would not question an imperialist campaign to subdue, control and steal from a weaker native state. It wasn't an isolated incident. Taking history into account, it's just more of the same. And it's got nothing to do with being a self-loathing Englishman or hating the British or any of these fallacies that fly in the direction of those making these discussions. It's about education. It's about historical facts concerning oppression which have been neglected and brushed over in favor of misplaced patriotism, and also highlights the hypocrisy of many geopolitical arguments made today. Imagine a Kenyan or Jamaican being abused today by an English dude in Britain for coming over and taking English jobs, a cliché abuse often hurled at immigrants. How does such a statement be reconciled when taking into account the slavery, torture and mass murder Britain carried out in these two countries? The Blood Never Dried is stupendously detailed, but the main focus is the following. The first chapter details the horrid treatment of Jamaican slaves and their eventual rebellion against the British. The second covers the Irish potato famine. The third goes through the British opium wars with the Chinese, where they forced the Chinese to buy the drugs that were destroying their people, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of their atrocities in China. Chapter 4 follows the Great Indian Rebellion, Chapter 5 the invasion of Egypt, Chapter 6 covers the post-World War I issues the empire faced, like the Chinese Revolution and the revolt in Egypt. Then we move to the British betrayal of Palestine and the creation of Israel, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Holocaust, which seems to be the current mainstream narrative. And Newsinger proves this by bringing up things like the Balfour Declaration. Newsinger then moves to Quit India, i.e. the removal of the British from India, then issues in the Middle East, and then the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya, then imperialism in the Far East like Indonesia and Malaya, and finally an explanation of Britain's strange relationship with the US as a lapdog in the modern age, and an afterword to the second edition following British involvement in American imperialist wars. It might sound confusing the way I've just blurted it all out, but trust me, Newsinger delivers in an accessible fashion. The stuff detailed in this book is shocking, it's sickening, it makes you cry in both sadness and anger. I won't go into specifics because we'll be here all day. All I can say is get yourself a copy if you want a brief insight into the British Empire. And I mean brief because when the British began pulling out of colonies, in other words the natives fought back for their rights, the British actually destroyed documented evidence of their atrocities by burning them and throwing them off of ships into the sea in a move you can look up called Operation Legacy. Something which I don't remember being referenced in this otherwise fantastic book. So we'll literally never know the full extent of the British Empire's cruelty and brutality, especially with today's propaganda. This book comes highly recommended. It's a stunning work presenting quite simply the real British Empire.